Today, we're going to unpack the incredible 400-year story of the French Empire. It is a wild tale of huge ambitions, bitter rivalries, total collapse, and then a stunning comeback. So let's dive right in.
All right, simple question for you. If I asked you to point to France on a map, what would you do? You'd probably look for Western Europe, and you'd point right about here. And yeah, you'd be totally right. But that is not the whole story, not even close. You see, the real story of France stretches way, way beyond the borders of Europe.
So let me throw a number at you. 2.8 million. What in the world could that be?
Well, that's how many French citizens live in what's called France d'outre-mer, which basically means overseas France. We're talking about 13 territories, everything from rainforests in South America to tiny islands in the Pacific. These are the last little pieces of what was once a massive global empire.
So that's the big question we're tackling today. How did an empire that was, at its height, the second largest on the planet, shrink down to this collection of distant territories? To figure that out, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
Our story kicks off with the First Colonial Empire. This was a period defined by these huge, grand ambitions that were met with some pretty spectacular failures before they finally got it right.
You know, what's really amazing is just how hard it was for France to get going. The whole 16th century was just one failed attempt after another. They mapped the North American coast, but didn't actually settle there. They built a fort in what they called New France, only to abandon it. They even tried setting up colonies in Brazil and Florida, but those got completely wiped out by their rivals, the Portuguese and the Spanish. It was just a really frustrating century for them.
So what finally flipped the switch in the 17th century? Well, it came down to one thing: fur. To be specific, beaver fur. The demand for beaver pelts back in Europe was absolutely enormous, and the forests of North America were just full of them. This one resource, it was finally the economic reason they needed to make a colony stick. But here's the thing. A trading post isn't really a colony if you don't have people living there. So the French crown came up with this really fascinating plan. King Louis XIV actually paid for about 800 young women who became known as the King's Daughters to travel to New France. Their mission was pretty simple: marry the settlers there and help grow the population. And you know what? It worked like a charm. The population more than doubled in just 10 years. And with a solid foothold in North America, France went global. They claimed the entire massive Mississippi River basin. They set up incredibly profitable sugar plantations in the Caribbean, an industry, it must be said, tragically built on the forced labor of enslaved people. They even reached all the way to India, setting up key trading posts. France had finally built a true world empire, but it also had a very powerful rival. And that brings us to the next chapter, the Great Rivalry that would end up tearing this entire First Empire apart. For a huge chunk of the 18th century, world politics was basically defined by one single conflict: France versus Britain. And this wasn't just some little European squabble. Oh no, this was a worldwide fight for total control, a battle for colonial and military supremacy fought everywhere from the forests of America to the seas of the Caribbean. And this whole rivalry came to a head in the 7 Years' War. It's actually kind of crazy how a tiny event can have such huge consequences. It all started with a small skirmish in the American wilderness involving a young George Washington. That little spark just lit a fire that became a global war. Britain's powerful navy ended up being the deciding factor, cutting off French colonies from supplies and reinforcements. And for France, the result was an absolute catastrophe. By the time the war ended in 1763, the dream was over. France had to give up New France to Britain and Spain, and its power in India was completely shattered. With just the stroke of a pen, the First French Empire was basically history. But, and this is a big but, France wasn't done building empires.
So now we get to the second act, a whole new age of empire, but this time it wasn't driven by fur. It was driven by a desperate quest to get back their national prestige.
This new chapter really kicks off in 1830. France, trying to restore its glory after all the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, invaded Algeria. And that single act started a brand new imperial focus for them, kicking off 100 years of aggressive expansion all across Africa. During the late 19th century's scramble for Africa, when European powers were just racing to colonize the continent,
France carved out a colossal piece of the pie. As you can see, they created these huge territories like French West Africa and spread their influence across North Africa too. It was a race for power and resources, and by the early 20th century, a massive part of the continent flew the French flag.
But they weren't just focused on Africa, not at all. At the very same time, France was pushing east, conquering Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos to create what they called French Indochina. The empire was, once again, a truly global power.
After World War I, France got its hands on former German and Ottoman territories. And that's when the Second French Empire hit its absolute zenith. We're talking a mind-boggling 5.2 million square miles. But just like the first time around, this peak was about to be followed by a very fast decline.
And that brings us to our final section, the fall of this Second Empire and the complicated legacy it still leaves behind today. So what was the catalyst for this final collapse? World War II. The fall of France itself in 1940 completely shattered the illusion that the empire was invincible. After the war, people in the colonies who had fought for France's freedom started demanding their own, and those calls for decolonization grew into a roar that just couldn't be ignored. France didn't want to let go, though. At first, they resisted, and this led to a series of incredibly brutal and costly wars of independence. The bloody conflicts in Indochina and especially in Algeria shook the French nation to its very core. In the end, the cost in both lives and money just became too high to bear, and France had to accept that the age of empire was over. By the 1970s, that vast physical empire was gone, leaving only those 13 overseas territories we started with. But let's look at one final number: 238 million. That is about how many people speak French today in countries all over the world, from Quebec to Senegal. The political borders have all been redrawn. The soldiers left a long, long time ago, but the cultural and linguistic ties are still there. It leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? What is the true legacy of an empire? Is it the land it used to control or the voice it leaves behind?